You should never meet your heroes, but you can phone them. Last week I phoned Mick Jackson. Mick Jackson is the director of Threads. Enough said. Let's begin. Threads doesn't need an introduction. If you're listening to this podcast, then you already know it. You might not have been brave enough to actually watch it yet, as some listeners have confessed to me, but you will certainly know it. You'll also know that I'm writing a book about our preparations for nuclear war, and as part of the research for the BBC chapter, I emailed Mick Jackson's agent and asked if I might interview him. I was almost embarrassed in doing so, thinking he won't have time for a pipsqueak like me. But he said yes, for which I'm obviously very grateful. But I must also be selfish and keep some of our interview back for my book, which will be out next year. But I spoke to Mr. Jackson for over an hour, so we have plenty of material, and he agreed that I could use it and create a podcast episode. I told him, of course, how obsessed most of my listeners are with this film. And I told him that I saw it when I was 3 and that it has effectively shaped my whole life. The reason I have this podcast, the reason I have a book deal, the reason I have a career, well, I can trace it all back to Mick Jackson's brilliant film. He's now living in LA and I was phoning him on my Poxy mobile, so the sound quality might not be great. I've done my best to spruce it up in editing. Although I suspect, if you're like me, you'd listen to Mick Jackson talk about Threads, even if it was being broadcast underwater, during a storm, with a brass band passing by. And yes, even with a siren going off. I began by asking him the obvious question. Why nuclear war? What sparked your interest, as a young director at the BBC, in making a nuclear war film?
Why did I get interested in nuclear war? In 1980s, you couldn't help, as a thinking person, be concerned about the state of the world. I had been, worried since I was a student at Southampton in the 1960s. I thought that the Cuban Missile Crisis was going to lead to the end of civilization. But, even worse than that was when you get into the 80s. The Cold War, it's probably the worst since the 1960s. Just listing the things that kind of provoked anxiety. There was this terrible arms race between the Soviets and the West. The Russians had shot down a Korean airliner that invaded Afghanistan. Reagan was being very warlike and calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. And then there was his Star Wars program, Strategic Defense Initiative, that promised that they could get around any Soviet attack by just putting up this iron shield over the US. So anybody who thought about it was worried about it. The thing that occurred to me is that everybody thought about it, but nobody knew anything about it. That really dates back to the end of World War II, when Churchill was briefly Prime Minister again, and he issued an order that nobody should talk about nuclear war or make documentaries about it. And that was followed by the BBC and subsequently other broadcasting organizations through the Attlee era and beyond that, until Peter Watkins decided to make the war game. Nobody talked about it. Nobody knew about it. And more importantly to me, in what happened with Threads, and just going back to a precursor of Threads, which you know about, the Guide to Armageddon. nobody had any way of thinking about it. It's kind of a cliched phrase to say that nuclear war is unthinkable. It's unthinkable because you don't know what to think. You don't have any facts and you don't have any images in your head. You just have a sense of dread. And that's really not helpful to any kind of conversation. So I thought, it's the 1980s, here am I in my second marriage, talking about raising a family, and what am I going to bring children into? A world in which the future is, a few minutes away from destruction.
You heard Mick Jackson refer there to a precursor to Threads, which was a programme called A Guide to Armageddon. He explains that he was making some short popular science programmes at the time for the BBC, this is the early 80s, covering relatively light topics like futurology and why accidents happen. And the thought occurred that he might give nuclear weapons the same treatment. A short, popular science look at the nuclear bomb and its physical effects. What would a nuclear explosion do to a city, to a body, to the flesh of the face? In taking the idea to the BBC, he was clear that the programme would be non-political. Now, the reason he was extremely clear to his bosses that his proposed Guide to Armageddon would be strictly non-political and based wholly on science and fact and the laws of physics is because of the huge controversy in the 1960s at the BBC over the treatment of the war game. And we've discussed that, of course, in previous episodes. In a nutshell, for new listeners, a brilliant drama documentary about nuclear war was made by Peter Watkins, and as listeners will already know, the BBC refused to show it. It was too horrifying, they said, too dangerous, too risky, too truthful, you might say, and the Home Office were getting quite fretful. I'm keeping a lot of what Mick Jackson said about the war game back from my book, as I said earlier, being selfish, but I can say that he saw this proposed Guide to Armageddon programme as a way of breaking the ice. The BBC have been very quiet on nuclear war ever since that scandal in the 60s. So maybe making this programme would be a way back in. It would be a way of dipping your toe in the water. Make something which is purely scientific, and so no one in it is trying to make an argument about civil defence or about disarmament. It's just facts. It's just science. Here's Mick Jackson again.
It's completely non-political. It relies only on science, and it's like a consumer's guide, like a witch report on fallout shelters. That was the idea. The logic of that being, you can state scientific facts, and you can actually make it clear that you are not proselytizing. It's just the laws of physics. This is what happens. If you are doing a consumer's test, let's say, on how you can protect yourself from nuclear war, then you have to show what it is that you're protecting yourself against. And that was the idea of the half-hour program. Basically, narrated by Ludovic Kennedy, this is what a nuclear weapon will do. Blast, fire, heat, radiation, and so on. And this is how, by spending various amounts of money, you can protect yourself. Of course, if you show what nuclear weapons do, it is going to be horrific. So I used metaphors. For example, when showing the effects of flying glass, I cut from a still photograph of an old woman's face to a slow-motion shot of flying glass projected at a pumpkin. They obviously make that connection. This is what flying glass will do to a face. So it's very shocking, but it is scientific. It's a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for the BBC. I mentioned this to my superiors and said, I want to do this completely non-political movie. So I was, this was passed up through the hierarchy of the BBC, and word came down, well, okay, go and do it. Don't make any noise about it, and we'll look at it and what you've got.
Suppose, a mile above the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, on a clear morning, a single 1 megaton weapon explodes. This film is about what happens to a city, any city, underneath such an explosion. Most of us live in cities. How effectively could we shelter from a nuclear weapon? Would we survive its three main effects? At the instant of detonation, the temperature of a nuclear fireball is 20 million degrees, as hot as the center of the sun. This is the first effect, a pulse of intense heat and light. Across large areas of central London, people and objects burst into flames, melt or char.
A clip there from the very eerie opening segment of A Guide to Armageddon. And as Mick Jackson explains here, this little documentary, carefully scientific, carefully non-political, went on to pave the way for Threads.
So there was a studio discussion after the movie went out, chaired by Ludwig Kennedy, and everybody agreed, well, this is actually quite a good, public service that the BBC has done here. It's socially responsible, it's not political, but it is very informative. So that was a great surprise to everybody, and a very pleasant surprise. The earth didn't open and swallow everybody up. But I had, in the meantime, all the research that I'd done for that small half-hour documentary, I realized that what I showed, sides of beef melting in the shop window of a butcher and flying glass shredding a pumpkin, that was about the physical effects. But what I couldn't cover in a documentary was the psychological effects. And I knew from research by people like Robert J. Lifton, who had studied the effects of the exposures in Nagasaki and Hiroshima afterwards and the effect on the survivors, that the psychological effects and the societal effects were much, much greater than any physical damage. And you couldn't really show that in a documentary, but you could show that with a drama. So I prepared for that with the BBC's agreement. They didn't suggest this. I suggested A Guide to Armageddon, and I said to them, look, we got away with that. There wasn't a great drama and crisis and any of that. What I'd like to do is to go further into the subject, to deeply research, do a dramatized documentary. And they said, well, go with our limited blessing. Go do your research and then come back and we'll talk about it.
So Mick Jackson went off and did a couple of years of hard research. He says he made himself into an expert on nuclear war. But now he needed a writer. He would bring the facts, but who would create his characters?
I read all this stuff, I talked to all these people. I thought, okay, I know the facts now. What I want to do is take on someone who doesn't know those facts, to write a screenplay involving ordinary people who don't know any of this stuff, and all of this stuff will happen to them. And I want someone who knows about people. So my immediate thought, I had no other, I have to tell you, was Barry Hines. I love Barry Hines' work, particularly with Ken Loach, and I thought, if anybody knows about people and believable people who are just ordinary people and there's nothing special about them, that's Barry. So I went to him with this idea. Look, you and I will come up with a scenario, you'll write it, and then I will subject these people almost sadistically what nuclear weapons can do. And we came up with this idea that the shape of a life, it would begin with an act of conception, that fumbling and heavy petting in the car, as a result of which there would be a birth, and that birth would happen in the midst of a nuclear war. And then at the end of that, 13 years later, there would be another conception, a rape of her daughter. And that would end in what? A birth? You're not really sure at the end what it is that's been born. It's like that rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem. So that was the idea. And I know that Barry was very kind of conflicted about it, and you may have read about this, that it was a very tempestuous relationship working on the film. He wrote this screenplay, and then I insisted on putting these factual interventions, just giving facts through the voice of Paul Vaughan, who was then the narrator on the Horizon scientific program. And he said, well, what place does this have in a drama? And I said, well, it isn't a drama. This isn't a drama. This isn't a documentary. This isn't anything except what it is, the one-off thing. And the more oddball it is, the more it will stick in people's memories. And he fought that, and we had violent rows. It was good, creative discussion. And the fact that it ended up with this, not voice of God, but the voice of the laws of physics, saying, at this point the temperature is so and so, and at this point your flesh melts, and whatever. And you see these poor people who have no knowledge of that just go through the effects, and what happens to them is going to be devastating.
I started a Twitter campaign a couple of years ago to ask the BBC to please show Threads again. And I've also organised a mass viewing of the film where we all watched it at the same time and shared our thoughts over Twitter and Facebook. Despite these small efforts, the BBC haven't shown it again. According to their own website, it has only been shown 3 times. 3 times since its creation. 3 times for one of the best things they've ever broadcast. So we talked about this, and Mick made the excellent point that the film can't really age or get outdated, because nuclear weapons and the dreadful things they would do to us remain exactly the same as they were back in 1983.
None of that has changed in the years since I made Threads, and now it's the law of physics. Nuclear weapons will always do those things to people. I mean, you look at the film now, and it has a very dated quality to it. It's made in 1984. There's no CNN, there's no cell phones, there's no internet, there's no anything, and everybody looks like, they're out of another age. Clothes and everything, haircuts. But the moment a nuclear weapon drops anywhere near you in 2021, whether you live in Sheffield or in Seattle or in Seoul or anywhere in the world, your life will be changed forever in the same way as is changed in this film. So that's why I think what you're doing with saying, organising mass viewing, saying transmit it again, air it again, actually answers that this isn't a film about history, this is a film about now. I looked up this morning the atomic clock, because you make a reference to that in 2 minutes to midnight, Times Literary Substance piece, which I thought was excellent. It is no longer 2 minutes to midnight. It's gone down to 100 seconds, which is the worst it's ever been since 1947. That's why this film, I think, has some relevance now. Nuclear weapons still do all the horrible stuff that we showed, and we're now closer to it than ever. So I remember when I was growing up, there was a lot of talk, particularly in the 80s, particularly in the Reagan administration, about nuclear war being something you could control and maybe even win. They were talking about things like bloody nose strike, and that will teach them, and then they won't dare to respond, that sort of thing. And knowing all the stuff I knew, I thought, well, if you had any idea in your head about what a nuclear weapon would do, you wouldn't say stuff like this. You particularly, under the Trump, you wouldn't say fire and fury, phrases like that, which I know he used in terms of North Korea. Fire and fury like the world's never known. Someone said to me once, somebody who worked on the Manhattan Project, I wish I could take some of these politicians out to the desert, as I could before 1963, when they had, in the Nevada desert, nuclear tests, and you could watch them, and they sent out troops so they could see the effect on troops of the blast and fire and so on. And if you took these so-called experts and strategists out to the middle of the desert, made them strip down to their underwear and watch a nuclear blast, a nuclear test, so they could feel the blistering heat burn backwards by the shockwave waves at them, they would no longer be talking about winnable nuclear wars.
Now, given the amount of time and research Mick Jackson put into Threads, and given his noble reasons for wanting to make the film, would you be surprised to hear he was willing to pack it all in? To just pull the project in its very earliest stages? Just tell the BBC it's off? Indeed he was. Whilst he was working on the earliest stages of Threads, before filming had begun, he heard news from across the Atlantic. The American channel, ABC, were doing a nuclear war film. They were making, yes, the day after. And Mick thought, oh well, If they do a good job, if they do it well, if they do it right, then I'll pack it in. Well, he didn't pack it in. So let's hear his thoughts on The Day After, a film which some people still insist on calling the American version of Threads. Or worse, calling Threads the British equivalent of The Day After. I don't think the two films should even be mentioned in the same sentence. But let's hear more from Mick.
Can I say a little thing about The Day After?
Oh yes, please.
This is the big budget version. In 1983, I got word that ABC was doing this version of Nuclear War. And I thought, oh God, I'm into pre-production on Threads. I'm getting ready to start shooting, but I haven't started shooting. Please don't let them blow this. Don't let this become another TV disaster movie and start a new genre. Last thing I want is to make a genre of nuclear war films. If I can prevent that by doing something and doing it so shocking that it does everything it needs to do and never is repeated again, then I will have done good. But if I find out they're going to do it, I won't do that because it shouldn't be done twice. And I was prepared to pull Threads before shooting it. I could have done that because BBC wasn't telling me to do it. I was saying, I want to do this, and I got permission from the BBC to do it. If I had said, look, I no longer don't want to do this because ABC are doing it, let's stop, they would have said, okay, it's your choice. I saw The Day After. I thought, oh no, they did blow it. Now, I discovered afterwards that Nick Meyer, who was the director, had started out wanting to do everything I wanted to do with Threads, and then had run into corporate bureaucracy at ABC and the whole thing got watered down and changed. And at one point he resigned from the project and then was brought back again. Everything I thought you shouldn't do with it. You shouldn't make it a disaster movie. You shouldn't have a star. You shouldn't have an enormous budget. You shouldn't have state-of-the-art special effects and a musical score and all of that stuff. They did. I mean, when I give talks, I haven't for several years, but when I give talks about Threads, I said, just look at two sequences, one in The Day After and one in Threads. The sequence in the hospital. In the hospital, the lights are on. It's clean. Someone's being wheeled in on a gurney, and Jason Robards is being very noble. And in Threads, the hospital is overrun in Sheffield. There's blood and shit on the floor, and nobody has any tools to be a doctor with. There's no power, there's no water, there's no instruments, there's no anesthetic, there's no medications. All you can do is put salt in water and try and make some sort of kind of disinfectant. And if someone's got a limb that you need to amputate, you amputate it with no anesthetic. And that's the difference between you being realistic about the effects of nuclear war and being... There was one shot I hated. I know Nick Meyer did a valiant job and was beaten down in the end, but there's a shot in The Day After where the camera is on a camera crane, that's a kind of arm that goes up in the air, so the shot kind of rises above something. As the shot rises, you realize it's a survivor, a casualty center, and more and more people are revealed lying on the floor with blankets over them. And it's a very impressive shot, and it's actually a sort of homage to a similar shot in Gone with the Wind. And I was furious when I saw that. I thought, this is important bloody stuff. This is no place to do cinematic homages. It's just that's out of place here. It's an inappropriate genre to make a TV disaster movie in the American style with the American standards and practices of television companies. Not big enough to hold this message. So that's why I said, okay, well, I think they've blown it. Yes, it's had a great splurge, but I want to tell the real story and tried to do that in Threads. And having told it once, I don't want anybody to tell it again. Not through ownership, but just because, the more you show another version of it, a remake of it, the more you kind of inure yourself to it.
We went on to speak of the haunting, stunning, horrifying images that we see in Threads. My favourite is the melting milk bottles on the doorstep. That's the image I remember as a 3-year-old. The traffic warden's face, the bandaged traffic warden, I'm sure he haunts a lot of people. There's of course the bike caught in the tree, which has been thrown there, of course, after the explosion. The burning teddy bear, the burning E.T., the retching, writhing cats. The film is packed with these incredible images, which you only see for a second, but which, of course, stay with you. And Mick Jackson discussed another one, the burning hand, which emerges from the rubble. I'll let him describe that for us.
Those are all based on fact, based on photos of bodies after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this odd phenomenon that there would be a hand sticking out from the rubble. And as the body fat burned off, there'd be a little flame, like a sort of candelabra, from each finger. That's in there. There would be people blown on their bikes into trees, maybe on fire. Show that. So, cumulatively, I think it's all leading up to that climax where you have this, even if you're not aware of it, cycle of conception and pregnancy and birth. That cycle is repeated in the next generation, but instead of a birth, you have no idea on that freeze at the end of the film what has been given birth to. I've been reading pieces, from my file, and your experience of watching as a kid features in a lot of things. There's a piece by Peter Bradshaw in The Guardian about watching it, in his younger days, having to look away from the screen at that moment to know what to cut to. And Paul Whitelaw in The Scotsman saying that he watched it peeping through an open door. So it does have an effect, and I think it has a continuing effect. And I'm glad for my daughter that I made it, and if it can be of further use in the conversation, I'm proud of it.
We went on to talk about the makeup effects, which all, of course, had to be done in a very low budget. Mick had explained earlier that The Day After's budget was $7 million, whereas his with threads was £250,000. So they had to make do with what they had. How very British. Rice Krispies and tomato sauce were used to recreate some of the wounds. And again with Ruth, when she delivers her baby and has to bite through the umbilical cord, that big stretchy purple tube she bites into was actually licorice. It was made at Mick Jackson's request by the good people at Bassett's licorice factory. And when he phoned them and asked if they could do him an umbilical cord, they said, sure. What colour? And he said, umbilical cord colour, I suppose. So we talked of the makeup effects, and then he had something to say about the extras and the Sheffield City Council. So let's hear what Mick has to say about them.
We held a screening for those extras who'd been bullied into being in crowd scenes. I just want to say a word about that if you're not running out of time.
No, that's fine.
I decided to set this in Sheffield, not in somewhere like London, but I use the phrase, and it's an awful pun, it's bang in the middle. It is actually bang in the middle of the land mapping. And a place that is conceivably a target because of rail connections, its steel industry, which it still had at that time, and other chemical factories, and also the proximity of the RAF base and NATO base. So I made it in Sheffield, and I knew that the city council there had an anti-nuclear bias. So I tried to protect myself from that, from allegations of being biased and doing propaganda for CND, by saying, I'm going to do this film. I'll show you a guide to Armageddon, so you see I'm serious about this. I will not show you the script for this, and nor will I take any input from you on this, but I'll only tell you I will try and make it truthful and honest, and if you could help us in putting out the word that we're looking for extras to be in crowd scenes, that would be wonderful. And they trusted me, I'm happy to say. And we through this screening for the people who'd been in it, who happily done crowds listening to a speaker protesting before the attack happens, or being people fleeing during the nuclear winter into the countryside and so on. And they all happily did that, and they knew what we'd done in those scenes. But actually seeing the movie, people were crying all about it. People who'd been in the film, seeing their own city apparently reduced to ruins and seeing what happened to people. They hadn't made that link between what they were doing when the camera was running, small part of the film, to the overall thing. And I think seeing it all put together, it was just harrowing to see them weeping.
3 cheers then for all the brave extras. I had plenty more material, but of course I must keep some good stuff for my book after all. So 1,000 thanks to Mick Jackson for speaking to me, and of course for making this brilliant film. I mentioned on Twitter that I had an unopened Blu-ray of Threads to give away to those who retweeted my podcast link, and the winner is Jamie McTrusty. Jamie, I will get in touch about sending this to you, but if I forget, please do remind me. And if you enjoy my podcast, please consider supporting it with a donation each month. You can choose the amount, and it can be as little as £1. If every listener gave £1, well, I'd be off to Mexico. Actually, no, I wouldn't. I'd still be here doing my nuclear work, except I'd have better hair and more books. So if you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/Atomic Hobo. And remember, you can find me on Facebook under Nuclear Britain or on Twitter under Julie A. McDowell. So thank you all for listening. Please do seek out Threads if you haven't seen it. You can buy it now on DVD, Blu-ray. It's out there. If you've got the money, please do get a copy and spread the word about this magnificent film. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you again to Mick Jackson. I'll be back next Monday with another episode.